Ever wondered what it's really like? I mean, actually, like, to live day to day under the pressure of economic sanctions.
Yeah, it's a reality for millions, and it's way more nuanced than just headlines and political speeches.
Exactly. We're going deep on that today, specifically focusing on Iran, going beyond the surface level.
You're in for some really eye-opening stuff. We're working with this book by Narges Bajoghli. It's called How Sanctions Work, Iran and the Impact of Economic Warfare.
Okay, and what makes this book stand out?
It's not just theory, you know? Bajoghli brings us these real stories of Iranians from all walks of life, their struggles, their resilience, all of it.
So, like, paint that picture for us. What happens to everyday life, to families, when a country is under this kind of constant pressure for, well, decades, really?
Imagine you're a retired teacher, right? You're in Tehran, used to a decent life, middle class. Suddenly your savings, they're practically worthless. Prices are through the roof.
Oof, that's got to be terrifying.
It is, and it's more common than you'd think. The book tells the story of Hariba. She's one of many in this situation. She's now relying on her kids just to get by.
Wow, that really flips the script on the whole empty nest dream, It's not about enjoying your retirement anymore, it's about basic survival.
Sadly, yeah. And that feeling that your dreams are shrinking, that just getting by is a victory, it's everywhere in Iran.
So what do people do? How do they cope?
This is where you see that Iranian resilience, this incredible ability to adapt. The book talks about this surge in what they call the informal economy.
Informal economy, meaning what exactly?
Think of it like this. You've got Vida, she's a pastry chef. Sanctions hit, she can't get the imported ingredients she used to rely on. So what does she do? She starts her own business. Uses Instagram because, well, that's what's available.
Wait, a whole business run through Instagram? That's some serious hustle.
It kind of makes you wonder if, in a way, these sanctions forced people to be resourceful, to find workarounds they wouldn't have otherwise. You're spot on. That's the paradox. Alongside the hardship, you see this incredible innovation. But, and this is crucial, it doesn't erase the disillusionment that sets in, especially for young people.
What do you mean? Like, are they losing hope?
The book introduces us to Ali. He's a young chemist, and he's basically checked out of the system. He's not getting involved in politics, not really building a career. Instead, he finds solace in the mountains, hiking, disconnecting.
So it's like these sanctions have created this, I don't know, pressure cooker. People are either finding ways to survive, being super inventive about it, or they're so disillusioned they withdraw, like they're stuck.
And that feeling of being stuck, it bleeds into everything. It shapes the whole political landscape in Iran, which, as you can imagine, is already pretty complex.
Okay, so we're seeing the social consequences, right? But how does all of that feeling, ripple out into politics?
Let's talk about the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA.
Right, the one that, well, kind of fell apart a few years back.
Yeah, exactly. And that collapse, especially how the U.S. pulled out, it was a huge blow. Like anyone in Iran who still thought, okay, maybe we can negotiate with the West, that hope was shattered.
So it's like it reinforced all the existing mistrust, added fuel to the fire.
100%. And the book captures this so well with Shady's story. Remember her from chapter 1, the student activist?
Yeah, she was trying to make a difference.
Right. But after the JCPOA debacle, she felt completely speechless. Like, what's the point? And that feeling, that sense of betrayal, it's everywhere. And it's like, you can't underestimate how much of this whole thing, this JCPOA situation, played into the hands of the hardliners in Iran.
Because it confirmed their worldview, right?
Yeah.
Like, see, we told you the West couldn't be trusted.
Exactly. It was like they were handed all this ammunition, and it really shifted the dynamics within Iran. And this is where the book gets really fascinating, because it talks about this thing, this Maidanian mentality.
Maidanian mentality, what's that?
It translates to battlefield, right? But it's more than that. It's this whole way of seeing the world. Like, Iran's under constant siege. Like, they're in a multi-front war with the U.S. and its allies, basically.
So it goes beyond just politics or the economy. It's about survival, about defending the homeland no matter what.
Yeah, exactly. And it seeps into everything. Like, the book talks about this professor, Reza. He uses this Maidan framework to justify, being confrontational. Like, any kind of diplomacy is naive because to him, it's obvious the West is out to get Iran.
Okay, so how do you even begin to unpack that? It sounds deeply ingrained.
It is, and it's constantly reinforced, not just by propaganda, but by real events. Like, think about the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Those were huge.
Right, Iran's neighbors, right there.
Exactly. And for a lot of Iranians, it confirmed their worst fears. Like, this is what the U.S. does, they're an expansionist force, and Iran's next.
It's almost, I don't know, tragic, this cycle of mistrust feeding on itself?
The book doesn't shy away from that at all. It shows us these individual stories. Like, there's Hassan, he's a reformist, an intellectual, he wants to believe in dialogue, but even he can't escape this Maidan mentality. It affects everything from government policy to what people talk about on the street.
Okay, so we've got these social impacts, this feeling of being stuck, disillusioned. And that feeds this Maidan mentality, this siege mentality. But what about the economics? The whole point of sanctions is to cripple the economy, right?
Right, but that's where it gets really interesting because Iran's story is way more complex than just cause and effect. Like, yeah, sanctions cause hardship for sure, but they also trigger all these unintended consequences.
So it's not as simple as we impose sanctions, their economy crumbles, they give in.
Not even close. Bajoghli does a really good job challenging that assumption that sanctions equal economic collapse. In fact, she argues they can actually create a kind of resilience, force a country to be more self-reliant.
Wait, so in trying to weaken Iran, the West might have actually strengthened it.
It's a paradox, right? But look at what happened. Chapter 4 goes into this, how Iran's economy, despite the pressure, it didn't totally collapse. It contracted, yeah, but it also adapted. So instead of relying on imports from the West, we see this rise of domestic industries. They had to get creative.
It's like that whole necessity is the mother of invention thing, right?
Totally. Remember Vida, our pastry chef from earlier? She's just one example. People finding these creative solutions using Instagram because they have to. Who knows what would happen without the pressure of sanctions,
It makes you wonder, yeah, would that entrepreneurial spirit have flourished in the same way?
It's a question the book raises, and there's no easy answer. But what's clear is that the Iranian economy, it's definitely struggling, but it's not playing by the rules the West set out.
Okay, so no total collapse. Instead, resilience, local innovation even.
Yeah.
But there's got to be a downside, right?
Absolutely. And this is where things get, messy, geopolitically speaking. Because often when you try to isolate a country like Iran to force their hand, the opposite happens. We'll take Iran and China, for example.
China's a big player in the region, for sure.
Right. And as the U.S. has pushed to isolate Iran, it's actually pushed them closer to China. They're essential trading partners now. It's strategic.
Can you give us an example of what that looks like, in the real world?
Yeah, absolutely. The development of the Chabahar port is a perfect example. It's this strategically important port, gives China a foothold in the Indian Ocean right by the Persian Gulf.
Wow, and Iran allowed that.
It's one of the ways they've adapted to sanctions, finding other allies. But for the U.S., it's like they tried to contain a fire and they just ended up pushing the flames outward.
Creating new hot spots in the process. It's like whack-a-mole, but with global superpowers.
Exactly. And that's the thing about sanctions. They have all these unintended consequences. You try to weaken a country, but often you end up strengthening their resolve, pushing them towards greater resistance. It's complicated.
It is complicated. But we've talked a lot about these big picture impacts, the geopolitics of it all. But what about the human cost? We met Fariba, Ali. What's the impact on everyday Iranians, broadly?
It's tough. The book doesn't sugarcoat it. Bajoghli backs up those personal stories with hard data, and it's pretty bleak. Between 2018 and 2021, Iran's economy contracted by 12%, per capita income down 14%.
Those numbers are huge.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like for people?
It means over 11% of the population got pushed into poverty. Millions of people.
Wow. And it's easy to forget that when we talk about sanctions, we're talking about people's lives.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the economic hardship. The book digs into how this constant pressure, this feeling of being under siege, it really erodes social trust.
Yeah.
Civil society takes a hit. There's this sense of fear and repression everywhere.
Because when you're worried about putting food on the table, who has the energy to fight for political change?
Right. It's like this vicious cycle. Sanctions are supposed to lead to change, but they also make it so much harder for positive change to actually happen.
It's a tough pill to swallow. So,
Yeah.
Is there any way out of this?
That's the million-dollar question. And I think Bajoghli really challenges us to think about this. Are sanctions really this bloodless alternative to war like they're often presented? Or are they, in a way, their own form of economic warfare with very real consequences?
Right. consequences for everyday people.
Exactly. And that's why I think this book is so important. It pushes us to move past the simple narratives, to really grapple with the complexity of sanctions. Because if we're going to use them, we need to be honest about their limitations, about the potential for them to backfire, and about the very real possibility that, well, maybe they're causing more problems than they're solving.
It's a lot to consider. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway you hope listeners will walk away with?
You know, Bajoghli says it best in the book. She argues that we've become way too reliant on sanctions. Like, it's our go-to tool even when a more nuanced approach is needed. We need to stop seeing them as this magic bullet.
It's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And it's more relevant than ever, I think.
Yeah.
This whole deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least.
Absolutely. The book is How Sanctions Work, Iran, and the Impact of Economic Warfare. And it will definitely give you a lot to think about, not just about Iran, but about the future of global politics.
Couldn't agree more. And for our listeners, the next time you hear about sanctions being imposed, don't just let the headlines wash over you. Dig a little deeper. Ask questions. Because the true cost of economic warfare, well, it's often far greater and far more complex than we're led to believe. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.